I'm inviting people to come to TABConf that are actually working in the space, that actually have these more educated opinions, so we can all learn together. Lightning isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily like a failed idea or like something. It's more the amount of time, resources, and energy being put into it maybe could be spent better elsewhere. Not having a plan before quote unquote Q Day is going to be a recipe for chaos and potentially the boogeyman for Bitcoin. We actually all care about Bitcoin deep down, and we have different ideas of how to, secure it and how, what makes Bitcoin good and efficient and stuff like that. So I think a lot of people are just going to agree to disagree.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X, here with another excellent episode of Supply Shock. We've got a great guest for you today, organizer of a TABConf community educator, builder of events, and Lightning developer at ZBD Pay. We're talking about Mike Tidwell, his event next week, of course, a pivotal event on the calendar of all who are interested in Bitcoin software development. So for today's episode, we're going to be diving into the TABConf schedule this year, unique perhaps in its focus on Socratic debates. So essentially pitting developers in a verbal battle over different ideas of the day. And of course, our podcast, if you have been tuning in and listening, most recently featuring merch of the Bitcoin Optech newsletter and Mike Schmidt over at Brink, very focused on the ongoing debates in the Bitcoin technical community. Here we're going to focus on, I think, some of the positive debates or debates that Bitcoin technical community should be having, according to one of the foremost experts. So welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks, Rizzo.
Yeah, excellent. We very rarely have a time to sit down together and check notes. So why don't you tell us what's coming up? Obviously, you've made me aware of the Socratic debates here. Maybe we can pick, and kind of go through the lineup in terms of, what is on the docket, or we could start generally, why kind of shift the focus to debate this year for the conference.
So TABConf is an experiment. We do things very bizarrely at TABConf. Everything is open source. Like we even organize on GitHub. GitHub is our database for the schedule. So we have a schedule parser that then reads it and shows you the schedule. So things update real time. Everything is community driven, all that kind of stuff. The experiment has gone from trying to make this completely like centralized and curated, like top down, to what does it look like to have the most impactful things on stage and have that be sort of community driven. The experiment has taken us in a position where it's very much audience participation involved with, discussion style debates and stuff like this. So all the Socratic talks and panels are, very like audience friendly to chime in, clarify, debate lightly and stuff. And we also have specific debate style panels, which I'm calling the rotating debate panels. We're having 2 this year specifically on that, where it's almost like someone sets a premise for about 15 minutes on like the topic to be debated, gives their opinion, what they think. This is a industry expert. For instance, last year, when we experimented with this for the first time, it was Matt Corallo talking about MEV and giving a context and premise, and then people get to queue up and go on stage as panelists, debate, discuss, ask questions, etc. So it's really fun because you get to involve more people in the room, and if someone actually has something really important to say that isn't being said on stage, it gives an opportunity for that to be voiced. So we're really just trying to make this the ultimate style conference. Now, this isn't necessarily good for business because obviously, like, sponsors can't, help, promote or whatever because everything is curated and you can't necessarily buy your way on stage or anything. But it's a lot of fun because a lot of the sponsors at this point are just more or less seeing their sponsorship as a donation. So, and people are going with it. We're really open to new ideas and things like that. So the 2 debate style panels that we're doing this year is on Lightning being a failed project. And ironically, I've been in the Lightning space for 6 years, so I obviously am biased towards liking Lightning, at least the way we're doing it.
That's a hot topic of late. Maybe we can just dive into, we've seen the narrative shift on, this layer two on the Bitcoin network, over the last year or so, becoming a lot more popular to critique the protocol. Why do you think that this debate deserved the forum?
I'm going to say something very controversial. I am a big fan of Paul Stortz. So, boom, hot take. A lot of people don't like him. A lot of people love him. Love-hate relationship with Paul. I actually love that Paul is a contrarian in the space, and that he is pushing for ideas that he believes in. And I like to see those ideas vetted in public and those ideas broken down or built up. So he is going to be setting the premise on why in 5 years you'll be embarrassed that you ever worked on Lightning. And then people get to come up and debate him on this, including Lightning experts, people like myself or other people that are passionate about Lightning. And we get to have a real conversation about it.
There's a line between, a lot of times Bitcoin and the larger crypto space, they can be pretty tribal. There's a line between FUD and debate, right? So some people, I think, want the Lightning as a failure to be in the FUD column. Why do you think it's worthy of the debate column?
So I think the angle that is going to be happening is, and this is what I think we might get down to, is Lightning isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily like a failed idea or like something that isn't working, at least to the extent that it can work. It's more the amount of time, resources, and energy being put into it maybe could be spent better elsewhere. And I think that's really the space that we're going to be exploring.
If you were to take the stage and debate this position, would you be on the pro side, or would you be on the anti? You would fight for continued emphasis on Lightning development.
I always like to think of myself as a naive optimist that thinks everything will always get better. So I am of the camp that B2B Lightning right now works excellent and is right now super good UX. People don't consider this real Lightning. Obviously, they want this to be more like peer-to-peer, no like custodians involved in the middle, etc. That I think right now is a challenge and will get better. So if Lightning still trudges along, the peer-to-peer aspects of it will get better. However, right now, the killer use case or the killer user experience right now involves something like a Wall of Satoshi or a ZBD, app or something like this.
That's been the narrative for a while, though, right? I think some people have seen it as like a large clearing network where you'll have like maybe a Visa and MasterCard, like a couple large entities kind of routing payments. And then there's been sort of people who want it to be more grassroots. There was maybe a third camp that wanted to sort of rebuild the whole internet on Lightning. Is that theory still out there these days, or has that been humble?
Man, that was like the PlebNet Prime, right? Where everything had to be over Lightning at one point. And even still, we're seeing like the value for value stuff still remaining with Fountain and Wavelake. But again, the killer user experience is still going through custodians right now. Very rarely will you have massive amounts of like really legit like self-custody Lightning kind of ideas do well at the moment without a lot of effort. I think it's really just like the more effort you're willing to put in, the better user experience. And if you have your custodian putting in that effort, then that's like no effort for you. I think it's really like how much effort are you willing to put in to make your user experience good. And a lot of people are like, I don't really want to put in much effort.
So in terms of the spectrum here, it sounds like Paul will be holding court, and then folks will be coming up, and I imagine he's arguing from the position of just, this is maybe my understanding of his tweets and commentary, just that there's been sort of maybe an over focus on Lightning, that it's been really the only layer 2 that's discussed. Obviously, I think there's been a big push for soft forks and other layer 2 type constructions, but VM, we haven't seen those materialize either. Maybe you can just give us your quick TLDR of maybe steel manning Paul's position before we go to the next debate topic.
I can't, in good faith, steel man his position perfectly where Paul might be happy with it, but I can give what most people would be happy with, which is things like Lightning are just, there's just too much overhead and convolutedness, and it's just too complex to think that everyone's going to be doing this self custody route for it. So we need something way better. The ideas of BitVM and Arc are still crap and not nearly as good as his idea with drive chains. And pretty much like anything that isn't drive chain is sort of like shit, more or less. I mean, I'm sure he's willing to change his mind as other ideas come up, but I know he is not necessarily happy with any of this. BitVM, essentially, I think what a lot of people are considering BitVM in terms of like the model, just like a more decentralized version of a federation like Liquid. Like it's just a quote unquote better version of it, arguably. But the user experience, I think, is going to be like really the deciding factor on if it's better than Liquid. And yeah, like the BitVM stuff is still like, I would say more like in theory mode right now, where we're sort of waiting till maybe end of year or next year before we see something more tangible there. The Arc stuff with Arc Labs did make something tangible, arguably, but I think they're still like in super alpha mode. I did actually do an Arc payment earlier this year through the Arc Labs network, or Arcade as they're calling it.
Yeah, so people seem pretty hot on that.
Yeah, but I think it's just going to go back to Paul just thinking these ideas don't scale well. It's going to still hit bottlenecks, and anything as a drive chain is sort of a bad idea.
So let's go to the next debate on the forum. So Lightning is going to be in the hot seat. What else is going to get dissected at TABConf?
The other big one is quantum and quantum FUD. So we actually have some non-Bitcoin quantum people coming out, which is fun. We have a lot of we have a couple pro people that are working on quantum ideas that are in the Bitcoin space, and then a lot of people that are like, hey, this quantum stuff is totally a distraction and FUD, and like look at the actual like logical qubits here. You're not even close. We would see tangible progress being made, and then we can get more worried about it over the next like decade plus. But worrying about it now and it potentially stifling Taproot or whatever it might be is more or less like an attack on Bitcoin, and we're going to be debating that essentially.
Yeah, we've had Hunter Beast on the podcast breaking down his specific proposal, Jameson Lopp as well, for how to handle sort of any sort of Q day where quantum computers start moving old Bitcoins. Obviously a divisive subject. Just talked to Pierre Richard in the most recent episode though, and he indicated that he does see quantum potentially being a split or some sort of disagreement about quantum. But so it sounds like, even if you have questions about the state of quantum computing, why is this not FUD? Why is this something the development community should be taking seriously?
Well, the reason to take it seriously is if quantum happens, it wrecks all these ECC blockchains that use elliptical curve cryptography without any sort of, backup plan. And if you have zero backup plan when this happens, you need to severely compromise on what Bitcoin is in terms of the decentralization nature of it. You would have to almost, like, I think the only sort of logical conclusion that people are coming up with is you almost have like a trusted committee that freezes Bitcoin and then migrates off, but now it's totally centralized through some sort of central party that helps with the migration through like some sort of out of band trust model, and that just is totally goes against like what Bitcoin is. So the migration method is messy, and not addressing it and not having a plan before quote unquote Q day is going to be a recipe for chaos and potentially the project needing to restart and potentially the boogeyman for Bitcoin. So when I say boogeyman, an unlikely event that will kill Bitcoin, right? And there's people think that Bitcoin is this perfect thing that can't possibly die. There are a few boogeyman for Bitcoin. One is it, gets technically attacked. And one is it loses its mnemonic properties of being the best money, the best currency, the best store of value, the best thing, the best arbitrary data holder, even, for the JPEGers. Like it just becomes the thing that loses its mnemonic properties where something replaces it, and it loses the hearts and minds of the people interested in the project. So that's the other sort of boogeyman for Bitcoin. Both of these things might be super unlikely, but that, you have to realize Bitcoin can die. and let's potentially remove one of those possibilities. Is I think the rational sort of approach of I can see the point of view for people wanting to remove one of those boogeymen use a situation.
So there's been a few BIPs proposed around quantum computing. We, obviously the technical development conversation has shifted much more recently to the Bitcoin knots and Bitcoin core debate. But, how do you see the quantum conversation advancing? Is it more BIPs? Have we reached peak BIP for the quantum, conundrum? Or do you expect, I guess, how do you expect this to proceed within the development community?
To be honest, I don't really know too much about the BIPs besides BIP 360. I know when I was following this a while back that Matt Corallo had a very interesting proposal that when I dug in was very much less interesting when I discovered that you needed to pre-commit to the quantum scheme. That was his idea of like having like a, oh shit, tap leaf in your transaction, tree of like, oh, well, if we have quantum, only this, designated leaf will be valid, but then you have to pre-commit to the quantum scheme, which might be invalid by the time you might realize it's not a good scheme. That's one of Matt Corallo's, or I think just generally a few people's pet peeves is we have sort of like these assumptions that, hey, we can use Sphinx Plus or Crystal Dilithium or like these various Falcon schemes or whatever, but it's all based on assumptions that they're quantum proof or that they're, quantum resistant.
I don't have the faintest idea of any of the thing that you just mentioned. What is that class of things that you?
So like the quantum proof cryptography.
Oh, okay, those are just names of protocols.
Right. So like you have to pre-commit to them, but none of these schemes are like necessarily super vetted. So you might just be going from the boiling water to the hot frying pan or whatever the analogy is. Like you think you're doing something that is quantum proof, but really it's just super new and it hasn't been vetted. And maybe it's still super susceptible to quantum computers, hypothetically.
Why do you think there hasn't been like a larger, like it does seem like the quantum computing, it's on the edges of the Bitcoin conversation. We really haven't seen, a broad user participation in the conversation. What do you attribute to that?
In terms of people being worried about it?
People aren't more worried about it or riled up about it. I mean, obviously, you have companies that are now raising on the debt on the public market sort of under the premise that Bitcoin is, going to be rising at a certain percentage annually, perhaps for all time. And meanwhile, there's a development conversation about quantum computing. Why do you think that's stayed on the margins?
Yeah, so funny enough, from the developers and the contributors that I've talked to, with Bitcoin, they're more worried about the marketing being too effective right now and distracting too much, not the opposite. They're worried that the biggest threat for quantum is the marketing and the threat of it potentially being a thing, not the actual quantum hacking itself. Now, in terms of why that marketing hasn't even reached more people, which, funny enough, like I said, they already think it's too well marketed. I would just say like, there hasn't been tangible logical qubit process. So there's the idea of physical qubits. There's the idea of logical qubits. And really what you're interested in is the logical qubits that might have many physical qubits representing that logical qubit. And I think what a lot of people are coming to terms with is for reliable logical qubits, it doesn't really scale with the current methods at the moment. And that's why there's still a bunch of R&D on other quantum sort of methodologies. Like there's one that someone's been working on who thinks like photonic or photons are going to be used for quantum computers, not these like little tiny like protons and stuff of various elements. So it's still like, what is the quantum computer going to look like and what's the method of it is still super undefined. And people are like, this isn't going to happen in my lifetime. And if it was, we would see linear progress for it. And we haven't seen any real linear progress, like the whole thing with like the 7 or 9 or 11 qubit computers, like the error rates are way too high for any practical reason. Now, this is me talking out of my ass. This is just what I've heard. I'm regurgitating these conversations that I've listened in on. And that's why I'm inviting people to come to TABConf that are actually working in the space, that actually have these more educated opinions, so we can all learn together. So I I think it's funny enough when we picked the light theme for TABConf, we picked this last year in October, November of last year, having no idea that Jameson Lopp and all these people would start writing all these papers like 4 or 5 months ago, or 6 months ago, and essentially destroying my theme for TABConf this year. So it's like we almost are like taking a little bit of a step back and trying not to over-index into the quantum discussion this year. But we are still having the debate panel.
Yeah, well, obviously a lot, a lot has happened in Bitcoin, and development moves fast. Okay, so what else is on the topic for the major debates? And I guess the big question is, are you handling or platforming the Bitcoin Knots and Bitcoin Core debate, or how have you chosen to handle that?
I don't think there's really a tactful way to just do the Core and Knots debate. I think funny enough, we're probably going to lean out of that and have more of a philosophical conversation about Mempool and try to not necessarily even talk about Core versus Knots or something like that. I mean, especially try to keep it super cordial and productive. Also, that's going to be an unrecorded event. I don't think we even need to record it. I think it's just going to be a Socratic discussion for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it might be. And it's just going to be something where I think a lot of people are just going to agree to disagree, or at least like it's going to be something where we actually all care about Bitcoin deep down, and we have different ideas of how to, secure it and how, what makes Bitcoin good and efficient and stuff like that. So I don't actually think it's going to be any of this sort of like Twitter stuff that we're seeing, or even like when Bitcoin Plus Plus happened in Austin, how they're, selling the Core and Knots hats and stuff like this. I mean, we're going to probably stick to the technicals, and I know that's probably not what people necessarily want to hear that are fans of Knots, but we're going to stick to the tech. And also, if someone has a good point to make about culturally protecting Bitcoin to be money or whatever, I mean, I don't see that we would limit their point or whatever. But I don't think I just think the vibe of TABConf is not going to be this like super contentious thing. So I think the debates are going to be pretty cordial, honestly. So there's not going to be like fireworks or anything.
Right. And so it sounds like, I guess, would you think that, maybe there's too much like sort of fun in that conversation, or that it's not serious enough on a technical, the technical arguments of that community are not, haven't reached that level, or how do you view it? Right. Because I think there's a lot of people who, and we can kind of debate the reasons for this, right? But, essentially there's a feeling on social platforms that, users are not being heard by the technical community. You can obviously, there's lots of debate there in that framing that I just gave. But, that sentiment is out there and persists, that users are, quote, unhappy with the current state and use of the technology. How do you think through just knowing that sentiment is out there and then representing it at the conference or not?
Yeah, I think this is why it's interesting to have a dry sort of philosophy on it, and why it's like, how do I answer this question without pissing someone off is really what I'm thinking about. It's when you keep things dry and technical, you eliminate any of the emotional, cultural sort of, I guess, talking points. I know that's not what people necessarily want to hear, but you know what? How about this? Ask me that question one more time. Let me really delve into that, because I think it's a great question.
Well, so there's this idea that some Bitcoin users have that the technical community should, at least be receptive to their concerns, right? And that's essentially where you end up with, my response to this, and this will lead your answer a little bit, but like, is that, to the extent that the, Knots community has put forth concerns, those haven't actually materialized as real technical concerns that the technical community is debating, and thus they don't want to have those conversations. But users, again, are part of the Bitcoin network, right? They're an important part, and some of this constituency, wants to at least give the impression that it's concerned and wants some action on their behalf. So
arguably, Insta Gibbs, or Greg Sanders, we've, and when I say we've, I mean I'm talking about Bitcoiners. The Bitcoin community has taken two steps back to heed to the concerns of people that are interested in limiting op return size, or at least giving the node configurability. So Greg took a step back to include the data carrier, and Mike Schmidt he cherry picked, or he made a PR that took some commits, and now it is no longer even marked as deprecated. So we've taken 2 steps back, and it's never going to be enough at this point, in my opinion. It's I mean, the new argument is, it went from, well, why are you removing the filter? Just give it to us and we can defaultly change it, or we can change it, to now like, well, why is the default not something that we like? Well, wasn't the whole point that you wanted to customize your knobs? Like, why are you? So now like the conversation is just the default is wrong, so you're still an evil bad actor. In terms of listening to users, I really think people are misunderstanding this, that they want to listen to users making technical arguments, and that's the part that goes over a lot of people's head. Even funny enough, I like jokingly, I put myself out there to get dunked on, whatever. I like doing it because it expedites the learning process a lot of times. And I made a comment like, well, if you see all these concept knacks, don't you need a bunch of us plebs to make concept acts, to kind of counterbalance the knacks and acts? And I said this to a core contributor, and he was like, no, that is noise as well. Your concept act is completely meaningless, and the concept knacks without any sort of reference to code is completely meaningless, pretty much. Like, unless you are a hardcore contributor like a Luke Dash Jr., your concept knack is almost meaningless, like completely. And you thinking that you're voting on these GitHub issues and getting your voice heard is complete noise, not even going to be taken into account. Typically speaking, I want to say typically, because I would say it was taken into account because, like I said, they did 2 step backs. So arguably, I think Core made a huge mistake by making this legitimate, but I mean, that's another conversation. Maybe Core is going to not like me now, but you have this idea where people are concept acting, concept knacking, and the people who are contributing will actually think that this is anything besides noise.
And I would agree with your position as well. I did think that it was a mistake to sort of, backtrack from users when there haven't been technical arguments really put forward. But there are some folks in the, obviously in the Knots community that, I have respect for, and I listen to their arguments. I think what's hard for people to understand is, is that mostly this has happened sort of at the margins, right? And they don't understand the technical process and the technical debates and how forums like yours sort of contribute to actual, BIPs and code being written, right? So maybe you can take people through that process, right? So how would you expect like your conference to then, people come away from it, they write code, that's an expected part of the process, right? Is the actual authorship of code into the debates, correct?
Well, this debate requires no code. That's the best part about this debate, right? This debate is on vibes and you caring passionately about Bitcoin to want to do something. No one wants to stand by idle and see their project get destroyed or molested or whatever is the term being used. So a good process is and this goes back to like whatever rough consensus is, you have the mailing list, you have Delving Bitcoin. That's sort of, and I would say you also have local community groups like a BitDevs or like a TABConf or Bitcoin plus stuff like this. So you have venues for to meet people in person, have these real conversations, have them vetted. So if you're in person with someone, it's much more likely that you're going to get their time. If you made a trip out in person with a core contributor or a Bitcoin expert, to actually delve in and dig into your ideas. Also, the delving Bitcoin, you can also get free, access to people's opinions on your idea and the mailing list as well. So what a lot of people are recommending is you sort of meet with your friends, meet with your community, meet with your local conference, whatever it is, or, TABConf, Bitcoin plus like event, or OpNext, whatever it is. And Bitcoin conference gets a lot of core contributors, right? I mean, a lot of these conferences have little pockets of super highly technical people. You find those people, you can get your ideas vetted. you can have your ideas vetted on delving if you don't want to make an in-person trip. And then I think the idea is once you sort of think like, okay, this idea is like good. I've had like people around me, my little chat groups, my little whatever in-person talks, delving. No one's like knacking, no one's saying like this is a terrible idea. You open up a mailing list. A mailing post is typically, I think, like if we're talking like happy path, which probably never happens. Like this is like the happy path that like never happens. That's like maybe ideal. You have software to back it. Be like, hey, look, not only this, but there's software that can help you. Mailing list, no one highly rejects you. You answer everyone's concerns. You craft a BIP. You get a BIP number. You have code that supports it. And then you work towards a BIP 8, BIP 9 sort of upgrade process where it's like, hey, everyone, I don't see anyone disagreeing, and I think that next step on getting like a soft fork in or like a actual change is something that this is the part where it's like, hypothetically, we can all do this, but like we haven't done in so long. It's like, it's kind of like going to the moon. It's like, did we go to the moon? Like we haven't been back in so long. Can we even soft fork? We haven't soft forked in so long. So it's almost like a conspiracy now, whether or not, this is the actual process or if it's just, being told this is the process. But that is, I think, my best interpretation of how to get rough consensus and eventually, go through. If it's a change that requires a soft fork, going the BIP 8, BIP 9 route, if it's a change that you just want to like have, I think it's, once you have the BIP and you get a BIP number and you have code that runs it, I think you're sort of done. Unless you're trying to get it implemented in Bitcoin Core. But otherwise, if you're trying to say like, oh, these are the BIP 39 words or, whatever, you're just kind of adding to the space and what people can use as like some sort of idea of improving Bitcoin. But that
it does sound like there's some reflection on the mempool policies, right? There's some subset of users that seem to want the ability to change network defaults and then have, more of an expression, their node sort of be an expression of their want on the network versus maybe the core developers who see, their default and standard setting as more of a expectations management. It sounds like you find that philosophically interesting. So what do you think are the interesting parts of that conversation?
Specifically for like almost the idea of like one node, one vote in terms of like mempool relay policy.
Well, right. If you back all the way up, right, why does Bitcoin have a mempool? People want to send transactions, when they want the understanding that there'll be, that there can be this global competition for including those transactions in blocks, right? We've seen a bit of a fragmentation of that in that some of these transactions now are preferentially going to miners, right? So there's, I think, maybe a bit of a battle over, what the mempool can or should be, and how it persists, right? So I don't know, maybe you can give me your 10,000 foot take on the current arguments around the mempool.
Yeah, the thing that I think is hurting us the most with this conversation is framing, because, and this is when we get into these really annoying. Like I'll be following a Twitter thread. I'm just like, why? I'm just wasting my time looking at these, tweets go back and forth with Chris Guida and like anyone. And it's just like, these things are so circular. The framing is just so off with everything because everything becomes so binary or so spectrum immediately between responses, and there's no consistency. And it's just impossible for a sane person to want to engage with any of this. I feel like, because the framing is such where it's like, well, filters don't work. Well, filters aren't effective, or they are effective. It's like, well, what's your definition of effective? And like, these are the things that like where I'm saying the framing is the problem, because if quote unquote what effective means is, hey, your transaction may get delayed or may have to pay more to use like a slipstream, or may have to, run jump through a hoop, then that's effective. But some people would be like, well, that's not effective. You're incentivizing private mempools and centralization of Bitcoin and stuff like this. And I think if we could all like kind of frame definitions and like the ideas together, we would just agree like, okay, well, this is actually not effective or ineffective. This is subjective.
Well, I usually like take it all the way back. If I send a Bitcoin transaction, it's like I reasonably expect it to be relayed in mind, right? As long as it's valid by the rules of the network, I think I should have a reasonable expectation that happens. But it seems like now there's a contention over who or what should provide that service, when really that seems to be the point of the network, correct?
I mean, we're just getting into like territory where it's like are these node relay policy things, like is it more or less a LARP, and like do we have this false sense of like control and impact on the network, especially when only a very small percentage of the network can pretty much undo the effectiveness of a filter, hypothetically speaking, or its impact. Now, if like 100% of the nodes are running a filter, except the mining nodes, then you're going to have potential issues getting there. If you have the miners also running the filters, then the filter is going to work 100%. If you have this small, 10% of the network not filtering on this, there's like a very good chance like it's just going to get through to the miners, no problem, or whatever.
Right, but what's the high level conversation about, where's the mempool going? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Like, what's the ideal state? I guess what's the correct framing then?
Well, I made that little chart. That chart with the different boxes of transaction demand and filter percentage. I made that chart specifically to try to be like, all right, which box are we in right now? Which box are we debating in? Because debating you right now is like impossible without at least knowing like which box we're talking about. So I made a user like or I made like a transaction use case demand axis, and how many people are running a filter to prevent said transaction. And I made like different sort of personas in different boxes to be like, all right, which box are we discussing? Because the idea is if you can't frame the conversation somewhere, you just end up jumping around, and I feel like no progress is being made. Even with my attempt of doing this, very few times at this point, because people have dug in their heels so hard, very little progress is made. But I think the correct framing is it's so stupid, because it's like I feel like at this point we just need to agree to disagree, but the conversation just keeps getting more weird. So it's also hard to understand really what the issue is, besides just wanting to feel like you're making a difference and that you're imposing your will on the network with your relay policy. So I don't think that answered your question, by the way.
No, you danced around it pretty well. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like, again, users want to express their preferences through their nodes, right? Like we sort of agreed that there's some subset of users that seem to want this, right? You can debate the technical efficiency of it, of which you just, I think, did pretty well, which is, it requires a lot of activity for that to be effective. But I guess, where does that go? Like, do you view that, obviously Bitcoin is still functioning, right? Bitcoin is still working for the users. Maybe there's a bit more friction on some users. Is that okay? Is that, Bitcoin will survive, obviously, but
if you ask like framing, like what is the mempool for? I mean, a lot of people that have been in Bitcoin a long time are going to say, well, the mempool is for getting the transactions to understand what's going to be in the next block and to mine said transactions. And then you say something like that and Luke says wrong. And then it's just, where do you go from there? You know what I mean? It's like the mempool has never been for that reason. And it's just like, what do you do with that? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a base disagreement about, well, I think like there's this idea that the mempool, again, it's a word that doesn't, like, what does the mempool represent, right? And I think like some of the Knots camp, I've seen them say like, well, the mempool is just other people's computers, right? Like that's kind of the meme that they're kind of they're putting out there.
I've not heard that one yet. I've been off Twitter for 2 days, so I apparently not enough. So I missed that new angle. So
it's the new angle there. But yeah, I guess, the question is really just, so, it sounds like the technical community, according to you, it's like, the mempool health is fine for the most part, right? Even if some people are dissenting and have fringe opinions on its operation.
I mean, there's definitely like a push to make the mempool and like do stuff with like package relay and all this kind of stuff. There's like a push to want to make this as effective as possible, to set up Bitcoin long-term to have good ideas on what's in the next block, and to put all the miners more or less on as even playing field as possible, giving every miner sort of like equal opportunity. Not, I would say maybe like, what's the expression? Not equal equity, but equal like equality but not equal equity or whatever it is. Like they want everyone to be set up with the idea that you can compete, right, in this, almost like this Bitcoin free market mempool idea. And if you more or less incentivize private mempools, the little guy is going to set up a bunch of infrastructure and potential, private, ingress, and everything's going to be super out of sync, and you're potentially incentivize, or you're setting up the situation for more orphan blocks and more, centralization ideas. And they're sort of just trying to set up Bitcoin to be as central resistant as possible. They're trying to make it, they're trying to set up these things long term to have good game theory on mining distribution and decentralization. So I think I like understand it pretty well. You can start to get into like weird arguments where, hey, these miners, for the safety of Bitcoin need to, prevent JPEGs or whatever. But I don't know. I don't know. Where am I going with this, Pete? Reel me back in.
We're talking about the state of the ideas about the network and what to do with the faction that is increasingly divorced from the normative technical conversation, I think, right? And that seems to want to push Bitcoin back into some sort of democratic or some sort of I don't know. It's hard to know what that camp really wants, right? I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast trying to dissect it. As close as I can figure it, it's right. There's a desire amongst people always for Bitcoin to conform to their expressions of what Bitcoin is, and this seems like the latest, problematic entry in that series of, it's almost like our descriptions of what Bitcoin is the biggest enemy of Bitcoin, right? So this idea that Bitcoin became money and now it's just money. It has to be only money. And
the meme I saw was Bitcoin is money. And then the response from the Chad is Bitcoin is programmable money. It's like, ooh, Let me ask you a quick question. Do you agree with me when I say that no matter what Core does, it's going to be the wrong decision at this point?
I think there's an express appeal to authority in the conversation, right? That there's this idea that, something is happening on the network that people don't like. And then there's sort of, a group of people who are looking for someone to address this, right? And then you sort of look to the ways that their grievance could potentially be addressed, right? And so the way that I've summarized it is essentially, there's three ways their grievance really could be addressed, right? It's like either the Bitcoin core technical process begins to defer to, the user base in some sort of, concrete or democratic way, which it has historically never done. Though there's been attempts, right? You remember Bitcoin Classic and different elements like that, where people wanted, sort of user-based governance in Bitcoin software. That's not how it works today, but there seems to be some, interest in return to that. There's this idea that you could, that the meritocracy of Bitcoin Core is somehow corrupted by, liberal policies, and thus we need to create some other meritocracy that aligns with a different political perspective in order to manage the software, and thus have competing meritocracies. Though that seems sort of like you're asking for there to be competing political parties within Bitcoin governance, and thus that seems sort of like a dead end. And then the last one is, this return to the idea that Bitcoin development needs a strong man / benevolent dictator in the way that Gavin, Andreessen, and Satoshi perhaps were, or definitely were in their time. And so, there's this idea that there's, we just need some new authority, some sort of Trumpian figure to come and write the process, right? And so I don't feel like any of those solutions are particularly compelling, but that seems to be what that group is flittering around between those options, right?
Well, what the real point I was trying to make was, it just seems like Core is between a rock and a hard place, where they're either going to be seen like authoritarian assholes that are taking away knobs, or they're going to be seen as placators, giving the Xbox controller to the little kid while they're playing PlayStation to appease them. That's there is no I just feel like they're either going philosophically, if someone's
Well,
asking for
it's like a big block conversation, right? So it's like why it's like you go back to like why wasn't SegWit good enough for the big blockers? Well, it's like even though SegWit created a block size increase, and the net result of SegWit being activated was that the size of blocks was increased. The people who were the big blockers who wanted the block size increase were not happy with that because they had sort of defaulted towards a view that like the block size must be increased, through some other means, right? They were already so dug in on that. So this just seems like a similar version of that now, right? Where you just have like a party that says, there must be some way to limit, Bitcoin's transactions to get rid of these, unwanted characteristics of Bitcoin to prescribe to what we want it to be, right? So
the only thing that's a wrinkle in that is the ASIC boost Jihan Wu conspiracy angle. Right.
Well, there's debate over how real that actually was, right? Like
that's why I call it a conspiracy. I don't know, but I'm just saying like that is definitely an angle that a lot of people thought was real, that was influencing the conversation.
Well, so I don't know. One, maybe if you want to get like very deep and weird, I don't know how much time you have. There's like a spectrum I have where it's sort of like there's different theses of, and I think like Mechanic and Luke and the Knots crowd seem to want like a user-led software development process. They seem to want there's an explicit appeal to, users being in control of Bitcoin, and thus users should decide what Bitcoin is. The Bitcoin Core side of the spectrum seems to, be much more comfortable with like, and again, I would really caution those words because I think like it's not true that the Bitcoin Core implementation defines what Bitcoin is, but there is this idea that like the Bitcoin Core process is Bitcoin, right? It creates the Bitcoin software. And thus, everything should conform to its process, right? And I think like Luke and Mechanic have always, even back to they tried to start a UASF around Taproot, right, to get it activated. They've always sort of had this idea that you should appeal to the users. Luke was really comfortable with SegWit and pushing for the UASF, again, in the same idea, right? So you have this tension between, what should actually govern implementations? Like, is it the will of the users, or is it the technical meritocratic process of actually debating the best ideas, right? And there's a natural conflict between those two things. And what's being litigated now, I think, is what was left over from the UASF is that those groups, were back then aligned, right? Because the users in that case were standing up for the technical consensus. And thus the user activation of that technical consensus, those two groups were aligned, right? And now they're disaligned. And the fissuring comes from the fact that both groups come from a different perspective, right? There's the faction that believes that the users kind of set, and ultimately will decide the development process. And then there's sort of the strict development process. You could say like the third fork of that, with the Bitcoin Cash is that miners dictated the process, and that failed. That was a plausible course, but that essentially the construct coming into the fork wars was you had a miner-led process, a user-led process, and a development-led technical process. These two forks stayed together. They stayed in Bitcoin. And now they're coming apart, right? Because there's a natural tension, and one kind of has a slight preference for a certain, philosophy, and the other has another slight preference for another philosophy. And I think it's been exacerbated by this idea of some people who are sending valid transactions are not users, right? And some people who are paying for Bitcoin's network, properties are not users, right? So you're back into some, you're back at sort of some of the philosophical divides between, those groups, right? But I think on one hand, you sort of have, we, the users, are Bitcoin. This is the Luke and Mechanic perspective. Like with us, if we decide Bitcoin is, then it should go that way. And then there's the idea that the technical process is Bitcoin. And if you can't impact or are not part of the technical process, like you don't have a participation in that process, right? And we'll see how that plays out.
So the interesting part is the two small wrinkles are Luke is obviously a developer and has a history with committing to Bitcoin Core or to Knots, I guess, upstream to Bitcoin Core. I don't know how he wants to phrase it, but and then you also have Ocean as a miner. So you have a little bit of this sort of weird where the user, has the user, I guess, persona here has a little bit of overlap in the mining and the user space, both minority. What does that make you think in terms of the miner facet. If this is sort of dictated hypothetically, I'm not saying that you think this, but if this is a hypothetical 2 of 3, like you just need majority of the two personas to sort of help understand the direction of Bitcoin, where do you think the miners side on this?
Well, my understanding of the miners currently is that, there's been a huge contraction and consolidation in the industry, right? There was kind of a 2020, 21 like kind of explosion of interest. They all sort of went public, and now through the, public, being public companies and entities process are in like an increasing competition, like to outperform. And we're very happy with the increase in fees because it kept, their bottom lines and sort of businesses healthy. And that's sort of where you get back into like, the maybe what is the most interesting claim of like kind of the Ocean and Knots group is that, the miners that we have right now are not real miners, or somehow are an attack on Bitcoin itself, right? I don't know, right? I think that you ultimately have two groups. Like, one wants to deal with Bitcoin as it is, right? They want to kind of deal with the realities of the current network. And there's one group that seems more idealistic, and that they want Bitcoin to match like their perceptions of what they want it to be. And it's generally like, I just feel like that you go back through Bitcoin's history, it's like the people who sort of want Bitcoin to be something other than it is sort of in practice generally don't fare very well. And so you have sort of one camp that is like, on this more idealistic, it's because essentially their claim, right, is that like, the miners aren't real miners, right?
The problem is, I don't think you and I disagree on a whole lot, but doesn't make for necessarily the best conversation. But one thing I think is funny is I've seen both sort of comparisons here, where the people who are supporting Core now are like, oh, well, now you're the new Bcashers. You're the people who now side with the same thought process that Bitcoin Cash people had. And Bitcoin BTs, I guess you would say Bitcoin Core people or Bitcoiners are looking at the people who are like not philosophically focused and saying like, well, this is just Roger Ver vibes 2.0. This is just Bitcoin Cash vibes 2.0. And I think it's funny that I've seen comparisons where I would say both sort of sets of people have been compared to Bitcoin Cash people as like a negative. So I thought that was funny.
I did a podcast with Johnny Beers, and it was basically like, okay, who is the heir to the small blockers? Like, both of the current, factions want to be the inheritors of, the past, winners, right? But that can't be true. I don't know. I really, for me, I've perhaps, it's hard for me to really be in the podcast seat in these conversations, because I feel like I've been the longest person in the position of the Knots person. The sort of Knots group is the inheritor to the Bitcoin Cash ideology, and that it's pretty obvious that that's true. And I think the way that I've always argued that is essentially like, they want Bitcoin to conform to their definition of what it is, right? And so they're kind of coming from the same way that the Bcashers needed Bitcoin to be a payment system and operated from that premise, and then optimized for, wanted the technical decisions to conform to that outcome. You could argue that maybe Bitcoin Core, wants Bitcoin to be a settlement layer, and that's their, kind of view. That I would argue, though, that that's the view, right? Like, that is the view that the developers have had since the fork wars, right? That's the consensus, right? And then so it's a settlement network for what? Well, it's a settlement network for adding a number of, top level things that are using it as a settlement layer for transactions. And the decisions of Bitcoin Core recently are very aligned with that perspective, right? I think the Knots crowd, they fall into the Bitcoin Cash problem of sort of saying like, oh, Bitcoin needs to be money, and therefore it can't do any of those things, or somehow it's worse money, but like they don't have any actual empirical evidence to really suggest this. And I think they're starting from a premise and then just sort of looking for.
You could also argue that maybe the Bitcoin Knots people are even smaller blockers, because now a lot of them subscribe to the 300 kilobyte idea.
So now but that's just kind of uninteresting because it's not like the block size thing really was not about. I hate like the problem with the block size was that it was very little about it was actually about. I mean the small blockers raised the block size, which I think negates a lot of people's should negate like most of common perceptions about what happened, right?
Right.
And so yeah, I don't know. I do think that. I don't know. I was a big fan of the ordinals wave, and I, perhaps one of the most public spam apologists of the folks out there of just, thinking that incrementally it brought in more people to Bitcoin. There was advantages for having this type of activity in terms of, mimetically, as you said, it opened up new avenues to emphasize how Bitcoin was better than the cryptocurrency world outside of it, and that ultimately because the people in that community weren't asking for any changes to how Bitcoin operated, I couldn't really foresee any issues with, what could possibly have been the problem. And so, now we have sort of a group of users who aren't enjoying, they've chosen not to have fun or see a positive in a certain aspect of Bitcoin. And now I think, I think, I've said recently that I think like they're ironically probably going to create the same outcomes that they fear, right? Like they fear that there's going to be sort of a, some sort of legal attack on Bitcoin or some sort of degradation of the network through ordinals and these. But I think ironically, it's like they're going to create that outcome themselves, like through attempting to get the software to conform to their own beliefs.
That's what I've been calling a self-fulfilling prophecy of dystopic beliefs. So it's almost like they're wishing it into existence by making it such a big deal. And I don't think I brought this up the other day and to a group of, I would just say, intellectuals that disagreed with me, but it seems like to me that they're making such a big deal about this that they're almost like wanting it to happen, like in terms of like justifying it. And I know that's no one would ever admit to that, and that's not what they would maybe say, but it just appears that way to me. And the counter argument to that is, which I can respect, is, well, if you think this is going to make it happen, then it's going to happen anyways, and we might as well address it. I'm like, okay, well, sure.
Well, and it's already happened, and it's always been capable of happening. And so like the problem that I think is like the Knots camp wants something that was always technically possible and will always be technically possible to be something that doesn't exist and can't exist. And because they ultimately want something that is, that they'll never have that need satisfied. They'll have to continue kind of going down their own avenue to achieve that.
So allow me to try to steelman the Knots position on this, and then you can give me your response, if that's okay.
Sure.
So from what I understand, the steelman to that is, even though it's happening or it has happened in the past, whatever, that we've never condoned it. We've never allowed contiguous bytes to be the medium for this, that we've openly allowed in terms of relay policy, opening up the relay policy and allowing large contiguous bytes of illicit material is now us allowing it, no longer condoning it, and now we're subject to legal scrutiny and risk and sanctioned data and stuff like this. So what is your response to that argument that I've been presented with from many prominent people, we'll just say from the Knots community?
Yeah, I talked about this with Pierre, when we broke it down, where it's essentially, it's like that exists already today because there are currently illegal things happening on Bitcoin. So it goes, essentially Pierre's commentary is that it was, this is just Bitcoin for criminals. Like this is the Bitcoin is for criminals FUD sort of being sold by Bitcoiners to themselves. And the thought process for that is like, there are always countless things going on with Bitcoin that, Bitcoin is constantly being used for evil. Like you have to sort of admit that in your head. Otherwise you can't actually move forward with the conversation where it's like, it is possible for Bitcoin as designed to be used for evil things. But, you sort of the way you deal with that is through regulation and through, as a society, you participate and you put reasonable guardrails in place to make mitigations on that, but that they don't happen at the actual network layer, right? And that no one has the expectation that they'll happen at the network layer, right? So like people are relaying and can send transactions to LFAC compliant things, and they have to take personal responsibility, for those actions. The idea that there is a collective responsibility sort of infers that there's some authority to which we would vest that collective responsibility. And in Bitcoin, there exists no such party, and Bitcoin Core is not that party. This is what I don't understand about the current conversation, is that a huge chapter of the fork boards, I feel like, was expressly the idea that Bitcoin Core is not an authority and is not in control of the Bitcoin, software system, and that there was one of the whole reasons that soft forks were preferred over hard forks and all these different things was this idea that developers didn't want to be perceived as authorities and aren't authorities and can't force people to update and comply with their software, right? So yeah, I don't know. This idea that it opens up a new attack vector sort of doesn't make sense to me, because again, it's always been allowable under the consensus rules, and so therefore it was always theoretically possible. The fact that you make it more, in practice, make it easy. Like technically, anytime you improve the Bitcoin software at all, you make it easier for someone to commit a crime with it.
Right. So just to reiterate, the idea is because this isn't what I'm trying to argue from my own perspective, but I'm just in good faith trying to argue the point, which is the reason this doesn't fit into previous models is because we've never quote unquote legitimized it in terms of intent, and this is all intent legitimacy based versus any sort of technical capability. This is just us now allowing it and legitimizing it culturally. So it's a non-technical argument. It's a cultural, because we're culturally legitimizing it and allowing it now, it is now going to be subject for scrutiny, where previously it was not subject for scrutiny. And that is an argument that I feel like now we're stuck in this legal. Now the whole conversation has become legal, and it had.
But it's just another version of we are Bitcoin and we have some sort of collective responsibility to Bitcoin. Like it sort of boils down to this that sort of idea, and like again, it goes back to like, okay, well, why isn't the Bitcoin community taking collective action against things that it knows? So like North Korea's Lazarus Group, okay, they've hacked and stolen a number. Okay, so like where's the appeal to collective action to stop North Korea's use of the Bitcoin network for whatever reason, right? So like there's this it's a appeal to collective action that suggests that there's some responsibility for the activity, and so it's like, just because it's not normative, like I don't understand, because again, it's like you can go back to the history of Bitcoin and there's images all through it. There's 2 years ago people were popularly bull posting images of hex images of Len Sassaman, that were engraved in the blockchain, and they thought it was some great thing, right? And so like it's always been possible to pass data and text through Bitcoin, right? And so nothing has changed, right? There's no and that's why I said, if you have to go to what you said, it's like, okay, well, you're making it easier. And so then the argument sort of becomes, well, if the threshold is you're making it easier for people to use Bitcoin for bad purposes, my counter argument would be, well, every time you improve Bitcoin at all, you could make that argument if you come from the perspective that it's possible to use Bitcoin for crime, which of course it is. So then, when you make a better wallet, you're making it easier for people to commit crimes with Bitcoin. And so should we condone better wallet software? Well, of course, because we have to make Bitcoin usable for everybody, right? And so here it's like, should we condone it being possible to send larger amounts of data on the blockchain? And I think the core development community is saying, I don't know, maybe you can answer this, but they're saying, yes, we should condone this because there's positive uses of it, including hashing, different types of schemes with larger data outputs, like what's happening with Citria and what could happen with ZK Starks and different things like that. And thus, there is no intent for this to be used for that anyway. So I don't know. I think the idea that it's becoming culturally acceptable just doesn't hold up for me.
If I were to try to respond Steelman style to you, it would be, but Pete, contiguous bytes. That would be, yeah, I think it's different now because contiguous bytes.
Right. Do you have a formal definition of contiguous bytes that you can offer me why I should be concerned about?
And again, I'm going to do my best here. Someone's going to be upset with me, but Contiguous bytes just meaning there's no every so many bytes. There's not a 20 byte, which is funny as hell because when you're doing inscriptions, I didn't know this until this year that the separator is the 20 byte or x0 0x20, which is the same ASCII UTF-8 as a space. So, and I knew that because of HTML and all that kind of encoding and stuff. But the funny part is the separator is just a space for inscriptions, which is fine. But with op return, you don't get those little separators. You just get contiguous hex bytes, whatever that you can parse, I guess. So that is the idea is there's no arbitrary separator every you have to push data in the push byte with inscriptions, but with op return you just push all your bytes together without any sort of separator in between them every so often, and now it's bad.
Okay.
I mean, no, this is legit become a semantic legal argument, and that's why I'm so interested in Ian from Ocean and what the lawyer from Ocean and him conversing with Joe and I forget his last name, Carlo. Yeah. Like the conversation has gotten so far away from anything technical that it's just now a completely legal discussion. And I know people are going to be like, oh, this is just yet the next talking point. It's going to be something else. But when I brought this up to Luke, he gave me receipts on how he showed me like, no, this is the biggest threat for Bitcoin. And I can show you that I've been talking about this since the beginning. I'm like, well, okay, at least you're consistent. Legitimately, it seems like you're being consistent on this. It's just no one apparently is everyone's cargo cult thinking around you, not knowing that this is your original position, apparently.
I mean, my thesis on that is still that like I don't think the Knots faction is like incredibly united, and I just think that there's a lot of people in the camp with like much, obviously like people like Luke, who I have a lot of respect for, have certain opinions that are very technically nuanced, but then they sort of are cargo culted by the group of people who just want the outcome. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a long conversation to be had with that with a legal expert. I don't know. I don't think it's something that really keeps me up at night.
Well, what I would love is if the legal conversation got squashed. Unfortunately, if it does get squashed, I just think there's going to be a new talking point, but it would be nice to squash that argument because it's probably the most disturbing out of all the
Kyle Torpy wrote a piece for Protos recently where he talked to like 10 lawyers and they by and large thought that it was overblown, and so it does seem like there's been some credible reporting in that area. But yeah, look, I don't know. I think some people just aren't happy with the fact that there are images on Bitcoin and tokens on Bitcoin, in which case, there's the long history of this is what Bitcoin is used for. And, people have used Bitcoin for this. And I don't know. I think it's again, it's like there's people who can't handle the mental complexity that Bitcoin can be many things, and then there's people who need Bitcoin to adhere to its strict definition. And so I don't know. There's an attempt, I think. I think humans naturally want to reduce complexity, right? And they want to remove nuance from conversation because it allows for people to feel more comfortable about things that they know, right? So, Bitcoin is Bitcoin. There isn't anything that has existed like Bitcoin before it. When people say Bitcoin is money, well, it's like there's a lot of economists that don't think Bitcoin is money. George Selgin routinely argues that that's not the case. Okay, so should we base all development decisions off of that, even though that's a contested, thing? So Bitcoin is Bitcoin, right? That doesn't need to go further than that. Bitcoin has these properties. No one's changing these properties. Nobody's arguing to change them that I can see. If they want to have that conversation about the consensus level, that seems warranted. But otherwise, you have to accept that people are going to find creative ways to use Bitcoin's properties, right? I mean,
we have to come up with a funny, a valid use case for Bitcoin is anything that self-identifies as a valid use case for Bitcoin.
That puts you in the conversation of like, I've argued for a long time. You end up in having to use sort of currently unpopular, somewhat politically leftist tropes to defend the the concept of some of these things, which just further sort of incites the Knots camp, because I think they're obviously somewhat a political coalition.
Oh, I don't know. I was just leaning into it. It's like it's just.
I'll dig up my chat from with Udi Wertherheimer 2 years ago, where I said, you're going to end up with people publicly identifying as BTC ETH plus. It's like I'm not a shitcoiner. I'm, I am, able to identify. I don't, look, at the end of the day, it's like, we don't have the ability to decide what happens on Bitcoin, right? Like, and there aren't authorities for us to appeal to. I think there's a lot of people in this camp who sort of want something to be done, right? It's like that's their whole energy. It's like something must be done.
I do think that's funny though, that somehow the core side is now the liberal Democrat side of the argument,
right? And that's where I feel like it's ultimately like a political, thing. And I've said even further, right? I think like one of the things that I think have exacerbated the conversation, and maybe this will be sort of the point about the cultural side, is that I think it's become a lot harder to contribute to Bitcoin meaningfully, because in 2020 and 2021, the cultural barrier to contribute to Bitcoin was pretty low. You got on Spaces or Clubhouse and you just complained about NFTs, and if you did that, like, you were a respected and viewed as a positive Bitcoiner, right? The barrier to entry was like pretty low. Now, in order to contribute to Bitcoin, it's like, well, you have to be Jeff Walton talking to Michael Saylor about how the reinsurance markets could be backed with Bitcoin for 30 minutes, or you have to be Eric Wall talking to whoever in the ZK Stark community about, how to embed, crypto proofs on Bitcoin, because the markets that now we're sort of targeting as Bitcoin expands, like, require a technical nuance, or you have to be in the Bitcoin core conversations, having technical conversations about, how the network should handle policy changes, right? So there's been this almost the cultural problem is, I think, that, people want to have a certain feeling of participating in Bitcoin, and they're used to this feeling of participation, and that's sort of been removed from them. But that seems like a natural development of the technology itself, right? It's not their fault, but it's also true that, like, I use this analogy that was pretty unpopular on what Bitcoin did show, but it's like, there is no internet cafe anymore. And I think what these people love about they don't love the internet. They love the internet cafe, and that the internet cafe can't exist in perpetuity. And Bitcoin is leaving that stage of its development. Like, it required that sort of, grassroots physical presence to, push its worldview and to become the technology that it is. And it's now becoming omnipresent. And, when it becomes omnipresent, like, you can't use it as a way to, like, it can't be your identity anymore. Like, you're not an internet person. Like, how much of your identity is based on the fact that you use the internet? It's like zero. And so the natural progression of the technology is that it has to lose those cultural components over time. And so that's why I think it's interesting that you brought up a lot of the actual debate around knots and their specific, is all about, we have to maintain this Bitcoin culture, and we have to, this cultural ethos, or, we have to have a culture of doing this or that. Which is true to some extent, right? I mean, it is true that has been true. But it doesn't feel particularly true in this instance, really. It seems like some people are trying to kind of impart their will on Bitcoin, which never really works out well for anyone.
No. Do you subscribe to any idea where there may just end up being a natural churn for Bitcoin every X amount of years, and we're potentially just starting to go through our next churn? Or do you not think that?
Like churn, you mean like people who just don't stay in Bitcoin for whatever reason?
Well, will this churn? Well, the idea is like just every so often, there's just going to be almost like a little bit of a civil war or something because Bitcoin doesn't have a direct dictator, benevolent dictator, because it doesn't have a direct democratic process, because there is lack of governance, that every X amount of years, there's just going to be a kerfuffle that sort of ruffles the feathers and churns out people away from the project that are trying to impose their will on it, I guess. And you're going to have
I like to think that we're progressing towards some complete understanding. But
what'd you say?
I like to think that we're progressing towards
Okay.
some complete understanding.
So we're not in a
But
cyclical loop of we're just going to go.
though
Sure.
yeah, I feel like there's a lot of there's obviously a lot of pressure on that position. But that's why I sort of described it, where I think like, you know, the fork wars ended with a certain consensus. There was a loose consensus because the two factions that sort of formed that political consensus are now sort of unraveling. But I think like it's obvious that they kind of, you know, from a philosophical standpoint, like had some sort of base disagreement. And then I think it makes sense for that base disagreement to be litigated. But I don't think there's that many options, right? Like as you go forward, it's like, you know, I think there's like dragon, you know, you call them like the dragon. You go down into the depths, and there's only so many sea monsters left, right? And I think for me, like one of the biggest, you know, I think the biggest long-standing one has been this idea of like, well, is the what defines Bitcoin, right? Like who defines Bitcoin and how does it defined? And this idea that like is the technical process Bitcoin, or do users define Bitcoin, and to what extent is there a check and balance on that? I think that's like where I would actually like, you know, I started off being, you know, the reason that like I have had a lot of friendly conversations over the years about this topic, even though we disagree with like Luca Mechanic, is that like I actually do somewhat actually like, you know, if you go back to 2021 and 2022, like I was talking to them a lot about, you know, it's probably good that Bitcoin has like dissenting implementations and that you don't have to follow, you know, what the Bitcoin core developers actually said, and that this is like a useful aspect of Bitcoin that seems to differentiate it from other cryptocurrencies. And so aspirationally, like I actually do think that like, you know, if Knots wasn't rooted in these things that I find hard to accept, it's like the larger palette that they're working in, like the larger, you know, like texture pattern that they're working in is this idea that like, you know, the users, and you can resist like the core developers, right? You can within Bitcoin carve out your own, you know, sort of I've called it like dissent, right? Like they're dissenting within the network, and I think that's a cool property of Bitcoin. It's just that like we've never seen like a large scale coordination of that work on like a long timeline, right? So nobody can tell you like whether that dissent, you know, there's a cost to it, obviously, right? They have to form their own development implementation. And then there's, you know, practical barriers to it. You know, it could be technically impossible, right? There could be some consensus failure as a result of them doing it, that imperils their Bitcoin transactions. But it seems aspirationally like somewhat good that you would want, you know, these kind of things to occur. I just think the basis under which this this particular dissenting implementation sort of is taking shape just seems somewhat disingenuous, because like I just don't I don't know, I have a hard time understanding like what they're actually upset about, other than people are using Bitcoin that they don't like.
Yeah, that's going to be hard to ever thwart. But do you think there? So in 2021 or 22, Luke opened up some CVEs, you know, which I think is really maybe the start of this. And those were, in my opinion, and from what I understand, just sort of ignored by the Bitcoin core community when he opened up those CVEs.
These were the attempts to close the inscriptions bug, right?
Right. And because those were never closed, or because they were never addressed, and because they were ignored, I think the op return data carrier thing is just the line in the sand, camel on the straw's back. And because so much focus has been put into op return and the data carrier specifically, people are cargo thinking around the op return being the issue, when really it's the whole idea has been ignored, and none of this is actually technically fixed, and none of this is a technical conversation, and really stems back to, you know, the inscription data being pushed onto Bitcoin was never addressed, and people are finding it really hard to reconcile and reason with this line in the sand being the op return thing, and it's almost being used as a scapegoat for the larger conversation. And I think that's also a very confusing part of this whole thing. Do you disagree?
No, I think what you're saying is correct. It's like there's so you sort of, I think the way I think about it is like you go with like there's an intent, right? And then there's like that sort of metastasizes around a cause, and then like a political faction sort of forms around that, right? There's some sort of incident or like cause, right? And so, inscriptions being invented is like number one. And then, people tried to stop that with like Ord Disrespecter and other things. And then sort of, people seemed okay with that, happening, because, one of the things that I find hard to reconcile is that like this if this amount of like anger had happened at the same time when like the blocks were completely full of this activity, like that would have made sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to me that it's happening now, like a year and a half.
Why is that? Why do you think they weren't able to rally the troops originally?
Because there wasn't a credible scapegoat. So one of the things that this group has wanted, and this is, again, I think that this is where you go to like, they want someone to blame for like what's happening, because they can't blame the software, right? And they've tried, right? They've tried to blame the fact that like the different software implementations have failed, or the software process was bad. There's something happening that they don't like, and thus they need to then find some reason. So it starts at like the end user level, right? It's like, well, something is happening that you don't like. If you were legitimately not on the internet and you were just using Bitcoin over the last 3 or 4 years, would you even notice that anything had happened?
I would be very happy that fees are down. For some reason, I'd be like, man, I guess no one's writing big JPEGs to the blockchain because fees are so low.
Well, but sure. Like, let's just take, this is one of the things is like, if you were just if you were like in a remote Amazonian village over the last 4 years that was completely conducting its commerce in Bitcoin, other than the change in fees, which is something that we expect to happen on the network, would you have noticed anything happening? And so the argument then could be maybe like, oh, the nodes, their nodes, maybe they would have had to update their nodes faster or something like that, which again, they should also have a reasonable expectation as an end user of the network that should also occur. And then you can go into, okay, like what are the bases under which that should happen, and how frequently that should happen. And, that seems all product and of the block size and sort of handled by that. I think the answer is like, no, I don't think those people would have noticed that anything had happened.
Well, I think the first thing that they would have done is that small community of tribal hunter and gatherers using Bitcoin would probably have been like, well, we should probably, put the knobs in our hands because we want more control. And this gives us a good feeling. And then they would then have saw, wait a minute, there's a 28,000 line diff between Bitcoin knots and Bitcoin Core. And then they discover Bitcoin knobs, which is a direct sync to Bitcoin Core, and be like, you know what? This is our tribal Amazonian tribe this.
Well, I don't think they would have noticed it, right? So like, removed from the cause, like if you remove the cause, right? Like if you didn't know that something had changed, like would you know?
Sure. Your questions are almost rhetorical, of course. Like you're not going to notice any of this crap, obviously. Yeah.
Right. So then it's sort of like, I think it's on the onus of certain people to then prove that there's a problem. Right. And then I think that's what that group has sort of grappled with, is that like there's something that they inherently don't like. And then they're sort of searching for some sort of problem to graph this on. And
the original threat was pricing out coffee transactions. That threat, especially with subset fees happening, it's hard to argue that point right now. And the threat now is being touted is, in my opinion, super disgusting and like just not even fun. Like it makes it no longer where this debate is something like I even want to be part of because of how like weird it's gotten. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's completely jumped the shark. Yeah, and I think the moment that it was clear that they will fork off as a result of it was with the CSAM.
But real quick, I want to say that Merch and I spent quite a long time, because originally we were in, like, I would say still we would debate these things in good faith. We tried very hard to address every possible concern with this upgrade, and I was happy because I'm like, yes, I want to do my part to help educate, and I love education. We came up with 40 Q&A, right? 40 question answers on everything from, will this require more hard drive space, and will this actually be more of a hindrance on my node, all the way to conspiracy theories about, like, is someone getting paid to do this with Citria or Citera, however you say its name. Like we covered the gamut of all the different kind of questions, 40 curated questions from Twitter and Stacker News and all that kind of stuff, put them all in easily indexed place. And I'll tell you, like, I got like a lot of good feedback from it, but at the end of the day, anyone who's dug in their heels, it made like almost zero difference, right? We tried to like really debunk any of these concerns, and when the concerns become circular, when they become emotionally, culturally charged, and when it starts going towards like, I need to protect Bitcoin because Bitcoin needs me, I'm here to save Bitcoin kind of thing, it's like you don't really have anything easy to work with there. And it doesn't help that, in my opinion, Chris Guida is doing an amazing job engaging clickbait, engaging people, because what he's doing is he's asking these, I would say, good questions, by the way. They're being answered, but then he will respond and say, well, you didn't answer my question, this.
Well, the problem that I've always said is like, and this is where I differ from like most of the Bitcoin core folks, is like, I always thought that like you would have to develop some sort of positive argument for ordinals and runes, which is why I tried to develop and circulate a positive argument for them. Otherwise you end up in what I would call like a very clear argument structure that like is exploited by the Knots camp, which is essentially like, okay, like there's Eric Wall has a post that is similar to this, but this is how I rhetorically would solve it. It's like, both sides, both the Bitcoin core folks in this case and the Knots folks are saying there's this problem on the network, right? There's all these people producing all this spam, right? And so in the case of the Bitcoin Knots group, they're saying, well, the way you stop the spam is like you make an attempt, to eliminate the spam, right? You make some sort of attempt, like you. So, and what the core group is sort of saying is like, well, these transactions are a problem, but our solution is basically, it almost makes it seem like they're disingenuous in the fact that they think it's a problem, because their solution to the problem is to allow these transactions to proliferate and to enjoy complete freedom on the network. Like that's their actual solution. It's like, how are you going to actually fight this problem? Oh, we're actually just going to make it so much easier for this activity to occur, right? So I think a lot of times what they effectively exploit is that it seems disingenuous, right? Because both sides are saying this is a problem. Where I think like if the core group took like a more neutral position and said, okay, well, like we can't actually make a discrimination against, these transactions, and we can't litigate their intent, and therefore it makes sense for them to then all be on an equal footing within the network. That would be like, you don't even have to go positive. You can either do positive, neutral, or negative. And I think like the Bitcoin core group is saying like, we agree with you, this is a problem. We agree with you, this is spam. And how are we solving this? Well, we're giving them the same rights and the same privileges as every other user. And so that is naturally non-intuitive to the Knots people, who then sort of say, like, for certain folks that you mentioned, who say, these people agree with you that there's a problem, and they're being disingenuous about how they're solving it. It's obvious because they agree that it's a problem, but their solution doesn't address the problem. And they're exploiting that to sort of inflame the people within their camp, because I do think you have to come to the neutral perspective, at least. I tried to argue for the positive perspective, which I think is valid. But you sort of at least have to get to the neutral perspective of, we can't stop what's happening on Bitcoin. Anyone has the opportunity to author software that interacts with Bitcoin and has a reasonable expectation that it will run. If you're setting in, one of these transactions, you should have a reasonable expectation that it gets relayed in minds, and that it's, you at least have to get to the median point, right? Because otherwise you end up with things that just don't seem intuitive, right? It's like, well, it's like, the Knots group, they're sympathetic because they're like a family with a bunch of kids, right? That like lives on a highway, and everybody drives 100 miles an hour, and the speed limit's 30 miles an hour. And so the Knots people are coming out of the house and they're saying, oh, it's a problem. Everybody drives 100 miles an hour down this road. And then the core developers are saying, you're right. Absolutely. We should make the speed limit 100 miles an hour, and they change the speed limit to 100 miles an hour. And the Knots folks are like, well, what are you like? You didn't solve anything. Like
these are analogies. These are analogies. These are the good analogies. I love these. Yeah, this is the fence analogy.
That's that is their understanding of the situation.
Well, have you seen the Eric Wall underpants analogy? Yeah, we can't talk about that here, but that's also
that's why I use the 100 miles an hour, because it's like that's that's really what but that's what creates the impression that like Bitcoin Core is disingenuous, like with, because again, these analogies don't hold true, right? It's like you can't actually use meat-based analogies for this, because within the confines of the network, it's like the network there isn't a family and a home and a street, and there isn't.
But let me point out something. These arguments, which I have stopped pretty much engaging with hard, which I originally was leaning into them. They're super effective, and let me tell you why. Is because eventually people who are super passionate, trying to do what they can to protect Bitcoin, will fatigue the other person and be like, hey, you know what? I'm wasting my time. Why am I even doing this? And they will just stop engaging. And then they'll say, see, look, he won't answer my question. And that's super good clickbait to rally the base and to say, like, look, they can't answer these questions. Look, he refused to answer them. Look at this dismissive, thing, that he said to me.
Yeah, look at these elitists.
Right. And it's like, well, you realize we've been talking about this for like 3, 4, 5 months. And it's like, and I don't think there's like I think it's great, because the more he gets ignored, the more someone gets ignored voicing their concerns, and the more they're ignored, the more almost like grassroots sort of firepower they have. And it's like, I don't know if there's a good situation for it, but I just wanted to point that out, that this has become very annoying and like very like time sucky. Like I think someone estimated we're in the quadrillions of, fiat dollars of equivalent time wasted on this. Maybe that's a little bit of exaggeration, but
well, hopefully people will see some more directional conversations at TABConf. They'll appreciate that we talked about our various ideas here. I think to an extent, hopefully people got some value out of seeing our different perspectives.
I'm looking for people who are interested in knots, people who are interested in core, people who want to come with true freedom ideas and run Bitcoin knobs. I'm looking for your arbitrary data maximalists and your arbitrary data minimalists. Everyone's invited to have a real conversation and keep things dry and technical. And I would like to say two quick little things. We have 2 evening events this year. One is on Web of Trust, because I think this is very important, especially not only for like rotating keys like on Nostr or something, but also like potential threshold signatures, and also just like knowing like what video and what music and what pictures are real, like just really leaning into the Web of Trust idea as a supported recurring TABConf event, and us starting and kicking that off this year. So if people are interested in DIDs and other decentralized IDs and other things, we're really looking to have a meaningful conversation where we can develop a process where TABConf can lean into the best ideas and help foster this Web of Trust idea. The other one is Meshtastic, connecting the local areas all the way across state borders with freedom comms, even potentially propagating Bitcoin transactions over mesh, so you don't even know what the entry point was to the network at the very first ISP level. And lastly, I'll add a third. We are doing a Warnet, WARNET, Warnet on Lightning. So we're giving Lightning nodes to people, and we're actively attacking Lightning and finding exploits and stuff. So there's going to be a lot of really fun events, and I hope anyone watching this, I don't know when this is going to go out, but the conference is coming up on Monday, October 13th through the 16th. So if you only can make it for 1 or 2 days, it's still going to be super worth it. Tickets are very affordable, and would love for anyone passionate about Bitcoin that thinks Bitcoin is already a good idea, find out, come out, learn what you can do actually that's tangible and what's next, and what you're interested in. We're not going to have speakers that go up and tell you Bitcoin's good and the number's going to go up. We're going to have tangible action items that are going to be interesting for you to get involved with. So that's my last shill for TABConf. So thank you for letting me promote.
We appreciate you doing all your work to educate. And of course, if you're still with us, if you've enjoyed that long conversation, leave a comment on YouTube or on Spotify. We read them all. And of course, if you're looking for other events, TABConf being one of them, but blockworks.co/events. Of course, a lot more coming from the team this year and next. You can find out more details there at blockworks.co. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.